I'm here on Coffee with Cornelius with Roberto Wakerell-Cruz, editor at the Post Millennial and host of This Week in Canada, a podcast on YouTube. If you enjoyed this content, hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more. As a matter of disclosure, I should mention that I have published previously in the Post Millennial myself. It's a great publication and you should check it out. And also check out Roberto's podcast with Nico Johnson. Roberto, thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me, man. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Okay, you're pretty young, right? How old are you, if I may ask?
You may ask. I'm 24 years old.
24 years old. How did you become editor of the Post Millennial at such a young age?
Well, it's a pretty long story. I guess I'll just condense it down really quickly. It was a lot of good timing, a lot of kind of just like lucky breaks, but at the same time, so I moved to Montreal about 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago when I was 19 or 20 years old. I had a hard time. I was always a fan of writing. I always followed the news cycle. I was always really into, what's happening in the here and now kind of thing. But I didn't go to a journalism school. I didn't go to university, which might be surprising to some people.
So you didn't go to university because that's the thing people say, right? Go to university, get a journalism degree, and then you can go to a traditional news outlet.
Yeah, well, I'm not really at a traditional news outlet, but that's probably why. But it's not for any reason. It's just I thought it was a scam more than anything. I kind of just didn't want to put myself in a lot of debt right out the gate, starting my life. And to be totally honest, I didn't really know what kind of career I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if it would be journalism or some kind of writing, any other field of writing. But through a couple lucky breaks, I went to basically a program that was, I think, is run by the Quebec government for types of minorities in Quebec. And because I was primarily an Anglophone, my French is okay now. I counted as a minority group, and they helped me with an employment thing.
Anglophones are considered minorities in Quebec.
Technically, right? They face barriers to employment that other groups, francophones, do not. So there's services to help find careers, jobs. And so what this program did, which it's odd enough I got this job through a government program where my job is to criticize the government so much, but I am thankful that we live in a country where, that's kind of how it works. I'm always thankful for that. But after they paid a percentage of your wage, I'm not sure how much, for the first 3 months, and then the company that you work for decides if they want to keep you. And I found it on Indeed. They told us to find certain jobs that you would want to apply for. The Post Millennial at the time was really small. I think maybe less than 10,000 likes on Facebook, and I joined as a staff writer. The Post Millennial didn't have any full-time staff, but because the wage subsidy, they subsidized probably a quarter, I would guess, of the wage. It made it easier for them to employ me. And now I've been there for over a year and a half now, and slowly, after a lot of writing, I've managed to get up to an editor position.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. That's well done. Yeah, congratulations to you.
Thanks, man. It's a bit of an unconventional story, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Post Millennial, would you describe it as a conservative outlet for young people? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely conservative. We're openly conservative. We're openly right of center. I don't think we have any kind of any problem saying that. I'm pretty sure it actually says it in our About Us page, which is odd enough. I mean, the culture, the company culture is pretty diverse. We have people that vote for editors, different, not writing editors, but video editors, and different people that vote for NDP or probably not liberal, but NDP or conservative. We have a lot of those. But it definitely is for, I think, younger people tend to latch on to what we do. Of course, by nature of it being conservative, we do have a bit of an older base as well. That's obviously nothing wrong with that. We just share the news that I think people are interested in, and young people, I think, are.
So you said that you have a diversity of views on your staff. Just for you personally, and this may not reflect people that you represent on the Post Millennial, but just for you personally, what does conservatism mean to you? What does it mean to you as a political philosophy?
Well, it started out for me with it kind of started when I first got taxed, right? I think it's a big shock for people right out the gate when you first start working, just how much of your money goes to the government. And you would think with how much taxation there is and how much, 25 off the bat in Quebec sometimes, 15% when you buy anything besides food. It's a lot of money, right? And you would look around and you would hope you see utopia. But I mean, there's definitely still a lot of problems. I mean, it's a pretty good country overall, but there's, the roads still suck. How's that possible?
Especially in Quebec.
Oh my God, in Quebec. You ever been?
Yeah, I go every year. I try to go every year.
Oh, nice.
To keep up my French, but the roads are awful there. The infrastructure is just atrocious, absolutely.
Crumbling, always crumbling. So that was kind of the first kind of wake-up call where I was like, wait. The government's not efficient and they're not all-knowing and
right.
doesn't know exactly what they're doing at all times with their money. And that kind of just irritated me. And it might have been because, I've come to some peace with it. But that definitely is a big part of it. I'm still not I don't think I'll ever be at peace with how much the government takes. And really, conservatism, I would think at its core is about small government, being able to trust free markets more, let the economy play out as it should, less intervention. Obviously, sometimes it might be necessary, but that's a whole other.
What about something like traditionalism? So, family values, would that be incorporated into it? I know that's sort of a Scrutonian maybe vision of it, having respect for your history and trying to figure out how can we make the way better for the future generations.
No, I definitely think that's a part of it as well. I guess I guess it's a two-sided kind of double-edged sword, but no drawback. I'm saying it's the economic side, but it's also the cultural side. That's really important, I think, to me too. Just upholding values that we worked really hard to achieve to this point. I mean, the ideas that we live by as a society took a really long time to actually get to this point, and preserving those things, I think, is really important and something that should be preserved in some sense. Of course, progress, I think, is really important in fields where there needs to be progress. But I find a lot of the time the people that want the progress want to tear, are a bit destructive and don't really have anything better to replace it with. So
that's absolutely true. Absolutely 100% true. How many people read the Post Millennial? Do you have any stats on that?
I haven't checked this month because we're getting towards the end of the month. I think unique visitors, we've a couple million, I want to say.
A couple million,
at least a million.
That's better than like the Toronto Star or I think even better than the National Post or Le Devoir, right? Am I wrong or?
Well, a lot of the Post papers, pretty much, I'm pretty certain. I don't get too into that, but I definitely know some things. Our Facebook engagement is pretty much bar none, besides like Narcity and the CBC. And the CBC, I don't think we're ever going to beat them. But based on how many likes we have on Facebook, we have probably 70,000 likes on Facebook, and our engagement is second to only the CBC and Narcity. And Narcity, Narcity is just kind of clickbaity stuff.
Crazy.
But yeah, so I think what we're doing right and what those guys are doing wrong is they don't understand what people want anymore. I mean, like the Globe and Mail, I think, has 700,000 likes on Facebook. I mean, not like we're only 10% of them on Facebook, but our engagement totally trumps them. And it's, I think, partially just because we are actually telling stories that people care about. And key thing, something that no other Canadian media is touching, because they're either lazy or there's too much, the editorial staff has too strong a slant, and they're just not touching a lot of the story I think that people actually want to hear about.
So that's interesting. Besides that, I mean, they're all kind of failing, even though, even newspapers, let's say like BuzzFeed, right? I can't really call BuzzFeed a newspaper, but,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, but they're supposed to be geared towards young people, such as your audience, I suppose, but even they're failing. So what are they doing wrong besides that? I mean, I was reading that these newspapers had to get a bailout from the government, right? 500 million Canadian dollars or something. So besides that, what are they doing wrong? How are they failing to reach young people in particular?
I think the tide is kind of turning with young people a little bit. There's a good Los Angeles Times article that was saying that it's a few years old. It might be 2 or 3 years old at this point, but it was saying that conservative youth, this is the most conservative generation since it was either the baby boomers. No, probably before the baby boomers. You can look it up. LA Times, most conservative generation. And I think that's definitely true. I mean, even in Montreal, and I have to prefix it by saying that I live in English Montreal, basically. I mean, my circle is very, very Anglophone, and a lot of people from Ontario, which probably helps. But even my circles, the ones that I hang out with, if they wouldn't call themselves a conservative, they wouldn't be shy to call themselves a centrist.
But I have to ask, I mean, my understanding that is even among Francophones, even among Francophone Zoomers, for example, there's a resurgence in Quebecois nationalism and traditionalism. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would think so. It's a weird kind of mix. I mean, in Montreal, not too much. Montreal's pretty metropolitan, very liberal. But there was like everywhere, a lot of Quebec voted light blue in that last election. And I think that is definitely... Nico Johnson, the guy that I host my podcast with This Week in Canada, he said something that was really, I thought, interesting, was that separatism is never dead, but it does fall asleep. And I think it does ring pretty true, where I think you have the CAQ, the CAQ government right now, who is basically made up of former separatists. They're more focused on autonomy now, which is kind of just what they've pivoted to, is that we don't need to separate, but we do need to be controlling our own destiny. And you have a pretty strong Bloc Québécois that really showed up in the last election. So that's definitely, I think, something to keep an eye on, because I think with separatism, it only takes 2 or 3 big things to happen to really spark that anger and the resentment and flame again. So it is interesting.
In general, do you notice that there is a generational divide between, say, Zoomers? I mean, I think you're probably on the edge, cutting the edge of the Zoomer generation.
I'm pretty close, yeah.
Pretty close. And, maybe I'm a millennial, I guess. People would call me a millennial. Is there a generational divide between those two groups?
Definitely. I think, yeah. So definitely. Again, I don't really know what to classify myself as. I'm really kind of just on the cusp. Like 96 is millennial, but it's really right there to the Gen Z, the Zoomer kind of guy. I'm somewhere in between, but I would think there's definitely a cultural divide in a lot of senses. For one, I think millennials did, as much as people like to rag on them, they got a pretty hard hand with as soon as they graduated, the economy collapsing and a lot of hardships in that sense. But more so on a political sense, I think Zoomers definitely grew up on the internet. I mean,
yeah.
I grew up slightly before the internet. By the time I was like 10, it started to become a thing. But for a lot of the Zoomers that were born 2002, they're 15, 16, or no, 18, not 18 years old now. There's never not been an internet. So they've been exposed to a lot at a very young age. I think especially in the YouTube of 5 years ago, when a lot of people are still, searching up, there's a lot more freedom of being able to find stuff that you're interested in. People were kind of getting turned on to right-wing ideas and stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if Gen Z ended up being fairly right-wing in a way, just because it's pretty natural to rebel against the current climate. I think that's just kind of what young people do. Even if it's not for the better, even if things are good, I think the youth will generally rebel. So you say what you want about how things are right now. I think conservatism is generally pretty good. And I think people are going to be turned on to that as young people.
Yeah, there seems to be a populist element in the younger generation. I've noticed. You mentioned that your staff, for example, is either NDP or conservative. There's not really many liberal supporters, right? They don't tend to gravitate towards these centrist issues. And both the left and the right have strains of populism. Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump. And it seems, at least on the face of it, like a lot of Zoomers are interested in that. Is that fair to say?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think so. Because, when you're 18, you tend to believe in some pretty crazy stuff. You tend to go pretty hard one way. I mean, when I was 18, and regrettably, I think it's pretty funny now. I used to be a libertarian. And I got the Gadsden flag tattooed on my left calf, which is still there to this day, and it's not going away, Now it's funny to me. If there's a little while when I really didn't like it, but now it's kind of like when people ask, I just go, yeah, I was 18, I was a libertarian, I was really into it. But definitely, and it's because it's for the people. I think Zoomers, they're generally interested in wanting things to be better. They're selfish, they're for themselves. Populism it appeals to that. It appeals to a lot of young people because it's really intense. The positions are really strong and firm. And when you're young, that's kind of the thing you want because you think you have all the answers, right? I mean, I certainly thought that the government didn't need to build the roads and that, a lot of, whatever.
I mean, when I was young, I was definitely a socialist. So I think that I'm very glad that I left that position because it's crazy.
Yeah.
But the fact that the young people grew up with the internet, I think, is interesting because I've noticed that the left and the right tend to be at least the populists tend to be very good at memeing, right? You don't see any good pro Joe Biden memes,
No neocons are really good at memeing, but yeah,
neocons, like, what are they going to say, right? Let's bomb another country. It's right. not a viable position. So I'd like to ask now, of course, one of these memes is that there's this mentality called boomerism. I'm not trying to pick on boomers. I don't think it's a good thing to do. I think it's not really helpful, but I think in terms of a mindset, there might be something called boomerism. Is that fair to say?
Oh, for sure. Like prejudice against boomers?
Well, no,
not prejudice, or just like,
but a certain mindset among people who may be boomers. They might be part of the silent generation. It could.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, look, this is kind of something I was thinking about earlier. Boomers get a lot of flack. They are definitely like a very defined generation. I mean, like I'm sure if you meet like 200 men between the age of like 55 and 65, you're going to find a lot of them are generally pretty similar in a lot of ways. They get a pretty hard time. My father's a boomer, so I don't want to speak too ill.
So's mine. My mom and my dad are both boomers, yeah.
So I don't want to say anything too out. No, no, I think what happens is they're a victim of time and policy changes. I mean, like, it's pretty tough to find a generation that's not selfish in some way. Did the boomers maybe kind of ruin the housing market for everybody? And
sure, yeah.
up to debate, yeah, I would probably say yeah. It certainly isn't easy for anyone to buy a house. Lord knows I'm not buying a house anytime soon. It was a little short-sighted. Some of the politicians brought in. You could say so, yeah, I would think. But
wait, even in Montreal, is the housing market pretty bad?
No, the housing market here isn't too awful. There's a lot of pro-renter laws in Montreal. Like, I mean, rent's fairly cheap. I'm not going to get into like, but generally, if you're moving to the city, you could probably find a place with like 4 roommates. If you're not in the downtown core, you probably get off with like $400 with 4
not
roommates.
Bad.
Yeah, pretty solid, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on here that is okay, even if the province actually doesn't know what they're doing and they're in horrible debt. A couple things are going pretty well for, I think, younger people. It's a good city to be like a young.
They might be doing better than Ontario at this point, to be quite honest with you.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, everything's kind of. Granted, I haven't been to Ontario yet because stage 2 just started. I'm from actually Windsor, so I can't even go back yet because today was the first day of stage 2. Because they couldn't take care of the farmers, basically, the immigrant workers.
Windsor is still in stage 1.
As of today, I think they're in stage 2. Maybe I would have to check, but it's now just 2 areas of Essex County. I think it's Leamington and Kingsville, where all the greenhouses are and all the Mexican and Jamaican immigrant farm workers. They're still on stage 1, so they actually went away from the county approach. But I can't go back, so I can't really say how Ontario's doing, but I mean, when I walk around here, everything's basically open besides bars that don't have kitchens. It's really the only thing. So the economy, I think, might do better than Ontario's. I mean, like, it was weird watching in Ontario the Doug Ford situation where you had a guy whose entire platform, his entire like political career was like, get Ontario's open for business, and then be so slow on like opening things, or just like if the policy's not matching up, or just, a lot of things, like when we were all watching Alberta and Saskatchewan. Granted, it's more sparse, less populated, but it was a little frustrating. So
Saskatchewan has been social distancing since it became a province. I mean,
you got to drive 12 minutes over to the next town.
Exactly. It's just canola fields, man. It's just canola fields and Canada geese. That's all it is. Okay, so So, I mean, this issue of Ontario and Quebec leads me to the next question.
Sure.
What do you think? You're the editor of the Post Millennial, very influential paper. And just
Thanks.
from your personal perspective, I'm not asking you as the editor of the Post Millennial right now. I'm just asking you as an individual. What do you think are the top 3 issues plaguing Canada right now that we have to deal with?
Ooh, okay. This is a good question. Top 3 issues plaguing Canada right now. I would say number 1, I don't know if I can really go in order, but this is definitely the 3 things that are keeping me up at night, at least right now. I think there's some really dodgy stuff going on with the Trudeau Liberals in China.
Mm-hmm.
I can't put my finger on what exactly it is or who they're trying to impress. We saw recently that the foreign minister, Francois-Philippe Champagne, owed $1.2 million to the Bank of China, which is obviously owned by the Chinese government. For a foreign minister.
And I mean, at the very least, he should lose his portfolio, I would think.
Yeah, dude, like it's totally ridiculous. Like it should have been declared immediately, and once declared, he shouldn't have gotten a role as the foreign minister. We all kind of knew something was up when he wouldn't name Taiwan. In Parliament they were thanking countries for the gifts of masks, and he was asked specifically if he would thank Taiwan, and of course he gave the more general, we have to thank everyone for doing their part, even though Taiwan sent over 60,000 masks or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing with Patty Hajdu, and that's the health minister, Patty Hajdu. I'm gonna guess it's probably Hajdu.
Yeah.
It was about whether the virus had been leaked from a lab in China. Something that FBI officials had said is possible and may have actually escaped from a lab in Wuhan. She dismissed it. She said, no, you're feeding into conspiracy theories. It's totally baseless. And then immediately after gets praised by a Chinese minister, like a propagandist, verified propagandist on Twitter. It's all a little weird. That is definitely a major concern.
Yeah, I was writing to my MP and I was telling him, we need to close. I was telling him back in January we need to close the border like other nations are doing, and he just completely dismissed me as a crazy person. That's number 1. Then number 1 is China. Number 2, what would you say?
This one's a little less pressing in terms of the impact it'll have, but I think potentially it could have massive impact. I think the state of the Conservative Party right now is really, really weak.
Yes.
And I don't.
Yeah.
It's really bad, man. It's really bad. And I don't know how much more liberal policies of the kind of Justin Trudeau type of liberalism that Canada can really afford to take. It's kind of scary to think that, if Trudeau were to call an election sooner than later, I don't necessarily see any 4 of the main candidates right now, any 4 of the candidates really being able to beat Justin Trudeau. I mean, maybe Aaron O'Toole, maybe, but it's definitely not clear cut.
Yeah, I don't know. I find people like Jagmeet Singh and even Justin Trudeau and the Bloc Québécois, they managed to really inspire the young vote in some way that I don't think Andrew Scheer can. I mean, the guy he looks like a flaccid. I'm not going to say what, but let's just say that he doesn't look like a guy who lifts. He's
it's a beta.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he doesn't he's not even Stephen Harper. At least even if he's not image-wise very compelling to look at, he has much more charisma than Andrew Scheer.
It's incredible, right? Because Stephen Harper isn't like a shining beam pinnacle of charisma, but he certainly, I think, mobilized votes way better than he did. I mean, it's just than Scheer did. It's really just sad because I think I feel like what's inevitably going to happen is that Trudeau is going to win. He's going to serve a 3rd term, and I think he's going to be remembered in a really flattering way in Canadian history, which is just not going to be true. I mean, this guy is a total schmuck. Kind of the media just love him, and I guess I'm about to get to my third point here.
Yeah, sure.
I think the state of media in Canada is absolutely horrible. So bad. And this is because I didn't realize this until I kind of started paying attention to the British election. I was in England during the British election, totally by coincidence. I was supposed to go over like for Christmas time with my buddy just before Christmas, and they called the election at that time. So I thought, oh, this is the Brexit election. That's pretty exciting. Like, let's pay some. I'm going to start paying attention and start to learn about British politics and stuff. And I got to learn it enough where I realized that the British press, almost more than I wish in Canada, is absolutely ruthless.
Oh, they're very pugilistic. Yeah.
Oh my God! Like some very nasty, will gnash your teeth. And especially the tabloids. I mean, when I read some of those things, it's actually kind of heartbreaking sometimes. But no, they don't let things go. Like they're so much more tenacious. I mean, do you really think I watched basically all of the Trudeau press conferences? It's like part of my job. It's a little. It really is annoying, to be honest. But I got to do it. I got to report it every day. But the day after Francois-Philippe Champagne, after it came out that he owed $1.2 million essentially to China, there was zero questions about that in the press conference after he gave his speech. I guess the questions after the press conference, zero questions on that. I believe 7 or 8 on systemic racism in the RCMP. I couldn't tell you why this kind of thing happens. I find time and time again that every time something big happens, I wake up and I'm like, oh boy, here it is. This is the big one. He's finally going to get pressed on something. Someone's going to say something. And maybe one question, usually from like Brian Lilly of the Toronto Sun, he'll ask something pertinent. But for the most part, CBC, CTV, Global News, even the National Post can be pretty bad, to be honest. The Globe and Mail, I mean, they're probably the best of the bad, but I mean, for the most part, the state of media in Canada is so just, I think, horrible at reporting the news.
I would agree.
Spineless most of the time, I think, and I actually think it's a really big problem.
Yeah, not much investigative reporting seems to go on in this country, to my great chagrin.
No, and they have this. They're supposed to have the time and resources to do it. It's especially bad when you realize that all these guys are going to get bailed out by get government bailouts. Who knows how that affects the editorial position? I mean, God knows it doesn't do nothing, right? And so, yeah, I think it's a pretty big concern. We're still growing. We have a pretty small staff. We really want to get going on more investigative journalism, more investigative pieces. The coronavirus kind of messed up a lot of what our plans, to be honest. Yeah. We were really on a hot streak and we were about to get going on some fun video stuff. And, we're still doing well. Like the videos are coming out and everything, but it threw a little wrench in it. But I hope the investigative stuff is coming, honestly.
Yeah. More. You know what I really like This Week in Canada. It's a great podcast. So on that note, Roberto, where can we find you online? I know you have a podcast. So I'm going to link to that podcast in the description below. Of course, I'm going to link to the Post Millennial, but where else can we find you?
So you can find me mainly on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Robertopedia. It used to be a podcast I had, but I never really followed up. So I got the title @Robertopedia. You can, of course, find me This Week in Canada podcast. The podcast is going pretty well, I find, and it's really fun doing it. I just finished our last one. That's basically the two spots. I do have a Facebook page. I don't really use it too much, so I'd just say mainly Twitter.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, thank you, Roberto, for joining me on Coffee with Cornelius, and you have a good one.
Hey, thanks a lot, man. Thanks for having me. A really good time.